So I have 6 topics I'm going to cover quickly because we only have 20 minutes. Talking about harvesting for these novel fruit species, labor costs, which is of course important, mostly focusing on Haskaps though for that. Talking about Haskap cultivar comparisons too, since as Zach pointed out, there's so many to choose from and they vary greatly in terms of production and flavor, as well as other characteristics. Brief discussion of juice characteristics, since some of these are mostly used for processing since they don't taste good for fresh eating. And then we did some consumer acceptance tests too for a few of the varieties that are compatible with fresh eating, just to see how well they stack up. And finally, for the species that are useful for fresh fruit eating, we did some studies on shelf life, since my background is in post-harvest storage of fruit, in particular apples actually. So for harvesting, I'd imagine most of you are familiar with a refractometer, but if not, I just want to suggest that if you're going to consider planting any of these fruit species, that you invest in one of these refractometers, because unlike other fruit species where you can taste them and determine if they're ready to harvest, the ones that we mostly use for processing, which are really the first 4 on this list, the aronia, currants, dwarf sour cherries, elderberry, they don't taste great when they're raw. You usually incorporate it into something and add sugar. So you might want to have a refractometer to enable your assessment of the Brix levels in the fruit. And the way you use it is just simply get a bit of fruit juice and squeeze it onto that little metal eye there on the instrument shown on the left there. And that'll give you a reading for your Brix. So it's a really simple tool to use, definitely worth the investment if you plan to plant any of these species. And I've just outlined here the indices that we use to determine when the fruit is ready to harvest for the different species. And this information is available on the web. I don't expect that you will remember it, but we have this on our website. But I also just want to point out, like Zach mentioned, that Haskaps, the color is deceptive. You should really rely on the Brix or on tasting them because they will turn blue before they're ripe. The birds will want to eat them too at that point, so make sure your net is up before they turn blue. But then really wait until the Brix is higher than 14 before you harvest them. And then for the dwarf sour cherries too, there are color cards you can find on the internet just by searching for the dwarf sour cherry ripeness cards. I have one picture there in the lower right, and they really turn a beautiful burgundy color before they're truly ripe. So you want to wait until they have that color. Since a lot of these are processing plants, I want to talk about harvest methods, and I'm going to first share the 2 sort of mechanical harvest methods that I see for berries. And the first is the one that's probably more approachable for the average small farmer, which is a shake and catch type method, where you simply shake the shrub somehow. In this case, we use a sawzall with a modified attachment, and I'll have some pictures of that. And then it just shakes the fruit off into some device to catch the fruit. So just below that saw is the wax wing harvester. And the fruit is just shaken off the shrub into the 2 metal wings that are shown there in the back of the picture. And then the wings are emptied into the trays on the harvester. And so that device is not super expensive and does really speed up the harvest process. And I'll have some information about that labor time later on. And then if you have just a very few shrubs, we have used and seen used very effectively a kiddie pool, just cut in half with a little circle for the stem point in the middle of it, to just shake the fruit off and then collect the berries and then dump them into trays. You can, of course, buy more expensive, larger scale berry harvesters, side row harvesters, or Joanna, or the over the row harvesters. Here's a side row harvester we saw in Canada, but they are quite a bit more expensive. So obviously that would have to make sense for your operation. And then I just wanted to do a species comparison here for how we view the species we have being compatible with these harvesting methods. So the shake and catch method that I showed really doesn't work for the aronia, currants, sour cherries, or elderberries, but it does work for Haskaps very well, probably the best for Haskaps and for saskatoons. But if the plants get too tall for the saskatoons, you do end up losing some fruit outside the wings as you shake the fruit off with the sawzall. And then of course, for most of these species, you can find an implementer, an over the row harvester to harvest them too. So just a few pictures of our shake and catch with the sawzall. We have a modified U-shape here that our farm manager Hayden welded up in the shop, and it just attaches to the sawzall. And then you just put this U-shaped device against the base of the stems and the shrub, turn on the Sawzall, and then just shake the fruit off. And I did want to point out here too that with this waxwing harvester, that's about $2 to $3 grand, you want to think about if you're going to use something like this or not before you set up your orchard. We have these 10-foot posts here pictured on the right in our orchard because we have to get in there and do research assessments all the time. But as you can see that this harvester is going to run into this post in this row, and every time I want to use this harvester, we have to pick it up and move it around this post as you go down the row, which ends up being very exhausting at some point. With the shake and catch method for the Haskaps, and probably the same is true for saskatoons, you do need to clean the fruit after you harvest it. I have a picture in the left showing the saskatoon or the Haskap berries in one of the waxwings, and it shows some berries and leaves and sticks and things. And what we do is just take the harvested trays of fruit, which you shouldn't really fill more than about an inch or two, and just dump them down the slide, custom made on the farm as well, on the right of your screen. And then while someone's dumping them, a person on the lower end of the slide uses a leaf blower to blow out the leaves and sticks, and then they'd fall into a catching tray at the bottom. You definitely want the person who's at the back of the slide wearing safety glasses and being prepared to get dirty. And then you just dump the berries after they've been cleaned into a tray. So I just wanted to give you a visual of how that cleaning process affects the berries. So here's the berries fresh harvested from the field with the shake and catch method. Got the leaves and things. Here's how the berries look after they've been harvested with the shake and catch. You can see there's still some stems on the fruit, which is actually a cultivar-specific characteristic that I've been documenting too and talk about later. These are the variety of Aurora, or the variety of Haskap called Aurora, and you can see there's a few stems hanging on here. And we usually, at this point, will just freeze them. And Bridget Jarrett, our lab manager, generally has advised that we go through back one more time after they've been frozen and pick out any remaining debris and check for bugs, things that you wouldn't want to sell to people. I did want to point out too that in our experience, the shake and catch method is not compatible with fresh fruit sales. On the left, you have hand harvested fruit from the Haskap variety Kiko. They look really great. In the middle is fruit harvested by shake and catch the day of harvest, and you can already see there's some juice in the fruit and kind of some broken, damaged fruit. And then we've also observed the day after harvest, there's juice that comes out of the berries and can even seep onto adjacent containers. And we've also noted too that there's some variability in the amount of damage that occurs in the harvest process according to cultivar. And I will document that, talk about that later. I wanted to share here too just some pictures we had of fruit harvested with the side row harvester, the large scale equipment up in Canada. Fruit harvested this way also gets damaged. So in my mind, you can't use this mechanical implement to harvest fruit for fresh market, Haskap fruit for fresh market either. So that ties into labor pretty well. We did all the information, we collected all the information that you would need to just estimate the costs for labor, for cleaning, for harvesting and for cleaning. And this is assuming that the fruit is going to be sold for processing with a price of $3 a pound. And we're assuming that the average plant is producing around 7 pounds. And so then the gross return per plant is $21. We're assuming about 1,400 plants per acre. So that's, or 14,000 pounds per acre. So that's the number of, that's the total gross return. And then we added up the labor costs after just timing people using this waxing harvester and a leaf blower method to clean the fruit. The labor time, so it's less than a half hour per plant. In fact, quite a bit less than a half hour per plant to harvest them and clean them with these methods. And then the labor cost per acre then ends up being around $4,700. So that's just the labor cost for harvest, but that could be used in your sort of mental or mathematical assessment of what your return per acre would be after you consider your other costs, including the setup costs and your maintenance, your weeding, etc. I just wanted to provide that, especially when you compare it to what you maybe could get for selling fruit in the fresh market. So we did a consumer study, a consumer acceptance study for fresh fruit, and we found that the average price that people would be willing to pay for Haskaps, for fresh Haskaps, would be about $4 for a 6-ounce container like this. So that's about $10.50 per pound. Then with the gross yield per plant of about 7 pounds, get $76 per plant, etc. So you might have a gross return of up to and over $100,000. But then the labor costs for harvesting by hand are quite a bit more. It takes over an hour and a half to harvest a plant by hand. So that's a pretty substantial amount of time. So you need to have people to do that, not to mention markets to sell the fruit at. So you're looking at a pretty big cost for labor, but potentially a much higher return for fresh market fruit. And I wanted to comment too that not all the fruit on the Haskap plants will be fresh eating quality. I've observed that, yeah, probably 70% are good enough to have for fresh eating, but then you have some fruit that have been damaged by a little poke from a stem or just aren't shaped quite right or have some other issue with them. So I like to keep a separate tray next to me when I'm harvesting fruit for fresh market and just put the culls in a separate tray and assign them to processing. Yeah, so diving in now into the Haskap cultivar comparisons, there's a ton of information here. I just wanted to walk you through the process that we're using to evaluate the Haskap cultivars, and then just advise that you go to our website or look at the handout that I sent to Dr. Black to put on the website to compare the cultivars for Haskaps. Zach already showed this picture, but there's incredible variability in the shape of the Haskaps from more round to more elongated. We also tested Haskap's cultivars' resistance to damage in harvest processes. So we carefully hand harvested fruit in the field and avoiding damage, and then brought them to the lab and put them through a drop and roll procedure, the exact same drop and roll procedure for all the berries we tested to determine how much damage they would incur. And we did find that there's variability among the cultivars in terms of the amount of damage observed, but this is just 1 year's worth of data. And this is also probably more damage than you actually would see in a field setting. We were trying to design a test that would actually cause some damage to occur so we could compare it. In the field, I've generally seen less than 10% of the fruit damaged by mechanical harvest, but that's enough to have the juicing and broken berries that would not be great for fresh market purposes. We have a bunch of other data too about fruit, individual fruits according to cultivar, including fruit size. Oops, I'm gonna go back to that. So we have some Haskap cultivars that have real monstrous fruit, more than 2 grams. So just to put that in perspective, it's probably larger than the largest blueberry you've ever eaten. And then we have some varieties, the Sugar Mountain Blue, Wild Treasure, Blue Goose, that are quite a bit smaller, less than a gram per fruit. So pretty small fruit, and therefore actually less efficient to harvest if you think about it, because it's fewer fruit per handful that you pick, most likely. We also collected a bunch of other data that I'm not going to share about things like that. I also thought that considering how even the fruit sizes could be important for mechanical harvest in the long run, especially if you want to use some larger implement. So I compare that as well. And this plot over on the right kind of illustrates that. You have the fruit weight and then also the distribution of the fruit weight evenness. So what this is showing is that the cultivars like Boreal Blizzard and Boreal Beauty have some monstrous fruit, but they also have some really small fruit as well. Whereas cultivars like Blue Goose and Tana, the fruit is more even in size, and that could enable the fruit to go through a harvester more smoothly if they're more even in size. But then again, you probably would want to use something like Boreal Blizzard or Boreal Beauty just for fresh market purposes. Some other characteristics I thought were important, both for mechanically harvested fruit for processing as well as for fresh market, is that some cultivars seem to have this ability to retain their flower after harvest. And that's not desirable because it doesn't only not feel good in your mouth, but also it could be a site for pathogen entry into the fruit as you store it for fresh market. And the same is true for the leaves over here on the right. Those could turn brown in storage and provide a pathogen entry there as well. We also rated stem scar wetness. So that is how the stem scar appears after you harvest it, whether it looks wet or dry, because that's a source of possible juice seep as well as pathogens or molds entering the fruit. So really what we saw here is just a few cultivars seem to hang onto their fruit pretty strongly, or their flowers pretty strongly after harvest. Stem scar wetness was the worst in Aurora, which is one of my favorite varieties, unfortunately. And then for stem and leaf retention, Tana, which is a really high yielding variety, later season, there's also pretty high leaf and stem retention for that cultivar, which may not matter for a U-pick operation, for example, but could be important if you're trying to sell at fresh market or freeze them, for example, and sell them as frozen fruit. The last characteristic that we've been going through, or we've been assessing, is pre-harvest drop. Some Haskap cultivars seem to have a lot of drop prior to the average fruit bricks reaching the optimal levels, and so we wanted to record that information. This is just showing fruit on the ground that were dropped pre-harvest. So this is not a desirable characteristic either, because those could be possible sources of pathogens for storage molds, or a spot where insects could breed, for example. And so this information, we just went out and actually picked up the fruit and counted them and weighed them according to cultivar to find out how much of the potential yield was lost in the field. And I know there's a ton of information for all these cultivars. So really what I did was summarize this in this giant Haskap table, which is sorted according to harvest timing. I put them in categories of early, mid, and late, which is over on the left. And you can download this from the website for this presentation for the Small Farms Conference, or you can check our website or email me for a copy if you're considering growing Haskaps. Just because so many of these fruits are for processing only and not for fresh eating, I just wanted to very briefly share some juice characteristics. It may not mean much to you if you're not already producing value-added products, but if you are, this might be helpful. The thing I want to point out about aronia is that it doesn't take much aronia juice to make whatever you're adding it to change color. I did this in the lab with apple juice in the last couple of years, and it takes like 5 to 10% by volume aronia juice to make the color change to a nice rosy pink. And we actually have a cider maker, a hard cider maker up in Missoula, adding aronia fairly routinely to their product to change the color. Then for elderberry, I think this is a difficult crop. I think, not only is it low yielding, but it also tends to be a lot of variability in ripening. So you have to harvest them repeatedly. So really, the main thing I want to say about elderberry is if you're going to plant them, look for something where there's even ripening. Our cultivars are not. We have to harvest them like weekly or so. Another comment too for processing it is that this is a pretty high pH. I think you'd have to drop that pH for food safety purposes. Finally, dwarf sour cherries, just juice yields and acidity. Brix is pretty high. We have tried consumer acceptance tests for these, taste tests on the dwarf sour cherries, and some people like to eat them fresh, but they are very tart. I did want to point out that they could be fun for a U-pick because they're pretty short and people can reach them really easily, and they're very satisfying. You can fill up your bucket really fast. So it could make sense to plant them for that purposes. But like Zach said, the Telco Rose is a really tall plant. I wouldn't recommend that one. It wants to be a tree. The other ones, Carmine Jewel, Juliet and Romeo, are a lot shorter, about 6 to 8 feet. Just Saskatoons, I don't have the full workup on Saskatoon juice qualities, but I did want to point out that there's a ton of pectin in Saskatoon juice. This is right after juicing, and I just put it right in this beaker, and it instantly solidifies. There's a ton of pectin, which could be useful for jam making, other processes, or problematic if you're making wine, because you probably want a pectinase. Just a few more slides. We did some taste tests with the Haskap, Saskatoons, and dwarf sour cherries, which are the 3 main species we thought there might be some fresh market for. And we did this with a CSA out of Missoula. We got over 150 people for each of these numbers that are listed here for the rating. People just rated the fruit, how much they liked them on a scale of 1 to 9. So Haskaps, and this is the variety Aurora, which is one of my favorites too, performed really well. We have some comments too there if you want to read them. I think what's really important to point out here too for the Haskaps is that we did a little shelf life experiment with the Haskaps here as well, kind of tucked it into this experiment. We stored the same variety of Haskaps for 2 weeks and sent it to the same tasters 2 weeks after harvest. And people liked it just as well after it was stored for 2 weeks as they had initially. So that's a pretty promising bit of data for their shelf life. Saskatoons, people like a little bit less. It's kind of a marginal number there at 6 on a scale of 1 to 9, with 9 being the highest rating. Most people say they're a bit too seedy. And like Zach said, like sweet sawdust, I personally love them, but I think it's a narrower market for people who want to eat Saskatoons fresh. Dwarf sour cherries, that number 5.7, I think that's below the threshold people would generally consider to be okay for thinking a fruit could have potential on the fresh market. Like this person said, they're very pretty, but they're just too tart. And we have I basically just passed all this data over on the consumer preference, a case test for the fresh fruit to a master's student with a person on our team, Dr. Wanyuan Kubo, and she will be writing this up and publishing it and probably presenting on it more. So if you want to find out more about this, Dr. Wanyuan Kubo in the food science lab at MSU is a person to contact. And finally, just a couple of slides about shelf life. I kept Haskap cultivars in storage for a really long time. I wouldn't say that this slide would suggest that you can keep them up to 35 days and have them still taste good, but you can see that this picture shows that they actually still look pretty good after being stored for 35 days. And we have a little bit of mold over on the left in one of the containers, but overall, I mean, they keep astonishingly well for a berry, is what I would say. Saskatoons don't keep as well. I would not suggest keeping them more than 5 days. What happens is when you harvest them, a bit of the peel is taken off with the stem, and they end up with this little like scar or cut in the fruit. And that's a great spot for mold to get in, as well as for the fruit to start drying out. And not only that, you tend to have uneven ripening in the Saskatoon, so you have variable color in your container, just not as good for planning to store and sell Saskatoons. So to summarize that information for the fresh market varieties in our trial, or fresh market species in our trial, this is my suggestions for for handling the fruit for fresh market. Both for Haskaps and Saskatoons, do not think that you can use mechanical harvesting. It won't work. They'll get too damaged. You want to hand pick them straight in the container and get that container as cold as fast as possible. You want to keep them really quite cold, just above freezing, and make sure that you have high humidity, because otherwise they will shrivel. And I just want to point out too that a standard refrigerator has pretty low humidity and tends to run a bit higher in temperatures. So you would have to probably invest in some kind of particular cooling system if you want to store berries for any length of time. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions if there's time. I've really tried to go through this quickly. I did want to mention that if you want to follow up on this talk, search for our website, search MSU-WARC and get to our website. And then also next week on March 10th,